and this will be placed online. So just a heads up if your video is, if you're showing your face, it will be on at some point with the video recording of this meeting. Okay, so with that, I think we're closing our public comment period and we're moving along in the agenda, and I'm going to pass it over to Heather. So Heather, hello.
Hi, thank you. So if we, I'm just going to, if Kat's going to move to the next slide, I'm just going to take a moment and just pull us back a little bit to our process before we dive into the meat of the conversation today around key differentiators. And I know we've all seen the schedule multiple times, but just to remind everyone kind of where we are with our process, we have our orange row, which is you all, the community task force meetings, the green, which represents our agency meetings, the gray, which is our community when we're going out for public comment, and then blue is when we go to our policy group for decision making. So we are here in April, where tonight we are going to be sharing some of the key findings from our technical reports and really how those key findings help to differentiate the alternatives based on the criteria and measures that you have all developed. We will be moving into our next meeting in May, where you'll actually be seeing for the first time the results of the scoring. And that will be the conversation that you all will be having around getting to a recommended preferred alternative. You may, in May, come to that recommendation, and if you do, then we will say great and take that to the public. And if we don't quite get there in May, we will come back in June to give you some more time to make that final recommendation if needed. I do want to note that on the green bar, which are our agencies, we have been working with the agencies this month in that kind of big oval box there to some workshops to help us in how we're defining the ratings, kind of how we're actually going to apply the scoring for the criterion measures for the alternatives. We had those meetings. We actually had some community task force members, both Art and Peter, attend some of those sessions, so thank you. We're working on the summary of those results, and we'll be sharing that with all of you prior to our next meeting. Once you do have your recommendation, the gray box in August, that's when we're going out to the community to get public input. We'll bring that back to you in September so that you can formalize your recommendation on the preferred alternative, which will then go to the policy group down in that blue in October. And then ultimately that will all get wrapped up into our draft EIS that gets published in January of 2021, and we'll have our formal comment period there. So just a process check-in on where we're at. And then I wanted to talk a little bit next, just as we're working through on the next slide, kind of how we're using all of the information that you've all been working on so hard over the past year and a half. So we're taking those criteria and measures that you all have developed, plus the value weightings that you assigned at your last two meetings, and then taking those performance ratings that were developed by the technical team and then vetted with the agencies. Then is how we're actually going to start applying the scoring. And again, when we come back to you next month, that's where you'll start to see how the different alternatives actually scored against the criterion measures that you have all identified to help you in making that recommendation around the preferred alternative. And so on the next slide, Cassie, again tonight, really what we want to talk about before we get into that, to the results of the scoring, are just highlighting some of the key differentiators that will be things that as the scores, as you see the scores at the next meeting, will probably help to make sense of why some things may be scored higher or lower for the criterion measures that you've developed for us to help get us through this process of selecting a preferred alternative. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of pause there and see if there are any questions before I hand it off to Steve and Jeff, who are really going to be walking through all of these key differentiators for our criteria.
So we're looking for any questions that folks have. Remember, you can raise your hand. Susan, I see your hand is raised, but I'm not sure if you have a question or if that's just left over from earlier. Susan, did you have a question? Oh, looks like,
I do not have a question.
okay. Looks like Fred
my
has a
hand is up. I
question.
don't know why it's down now.
Great, thank you, Susan. Fred, it looks like your hand is up if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question that I actually sent to Cassie earlier this week when we first got our packet. And when I look at the key differentiators matrix, I see red and I see green. But when I read them definitively, I see a number of indicators that look like they may fall somewhere in between. And from my preference, I'd like to see a third color added so that, because some of the alternatives may be closer than this makes them appear visually. It just concerns me from the standpoint of presentation.
Okay.
That's a
Okay,
comment,
thanks, Fred.
Yeah, I think that's really good feedback. And I think when we're looking, because we are looking at how we're going to present this when we go out to the public. And so that's definitely something we'll look at when we're preparing materials for that. So thank you.
Any other questions from folks? I also just want to say hi to Cameron. I think we missed you in the roll call. But hello, nice to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see all of you as well. Sorry, I had a doctor's appointment that I had to go to, so I was a little bit late getting into the meeting, but I'm here. Great to see you all.
You're here now. We're glad that you've joined us. Thank you. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. Fred, your hand is still up. If you wouldn't mind lowering that. If you don't have an additional question, thank you. Okay, so with that, Heather, I think we're moving on to pass it over to Steve.
Hi, folks. So I will be talking about the alternatives, just kind of a reminder about what each of the alternatives are. And I think last time we met, we had 3, and now we have 4. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that came to be. So starting at the top, we have our enhanced seismic retrofit. And as we've been talking about for months, that is the retrofit with a partial replacement, primarily over the freeway and the railroad spans, a whole bunch of deck replacement work, and frankly, almost every part of the bridge is being seismically repaired one way or the other. The middle 2 are now called replacement short span and replacement long span. And that really stemmed off of the in-kind replacement that we had, which really means if you look straight down from an airplane, it effectively has the same plan view or aerial view extent to the bridge. The difference is really in the vertical elevation, and it comes down to how long the bridge members are, the superstructure is from column to column. And so in short span, it's very, very traditional, very similar to what's out there today. It's sort of conventional span lengths that you would expect, girders that are below the bridge deck. The kind of bridge that's comparable today. Now, whether it's a lift bridge or a bascule bridge, that's up for continuation during the type selection phase, but really it's about the spans framing into it. The long span, however, is just like the name suggests, these longer spans. We introduced this at some prior CTF meetings. And the primary benefit of that is while you're touching down on those piers in the river, those other new longer spans frame much further. So you have many fewer columns on either side in the highly liquefiable zones. But what it takes is your superstructure built upwards. And so that's what's shown in this one picture. And then last is our couch extension, where it's very similar to the short span, except on the east side, it frames apart and creates that sort of wishbone shape as it ties back into the couch Burnside couplet. Now, we got a really good question from Ed about the long span, and it really it falls in the category of the devil's in the details and how you build something that's a longer span. So there's a number of complexities that come with it that while we've done a feasibility level assessment and some constructability reviews. There's a lot of questions that remain on how exactly you build something that's that long. There are a number of ways to do it, and it comes down in part to what is your access point and where do you put temporary supports and what is the contractor's perspective on it. And so this picture that's shown here represents a suite of different longer span options, all of which carry different ways you can build it. And so we've done enough testing and analysis to say it's feasible, it's viable, and there's numbers of ways to do it. Should it be selected, there's going to be clearly more studies on how best to build it. So I wanted to make sure that we captured a comment that came from Ed over the course of the last couple of weeks.
Hey, Steve, it looks like we have a question from Peter.
Okay.
Peter, go right ahead.
This is Peter now. I was curious on the extension that you're talking about, Cooch extension. Are we able to be delineating it? Like, could it just be a streetcar extension and that the auto would go the other way? I mean, how would that work if the extension would work for only one mode of travel?
We have not considered that. Can it be done? Yes. You'd be offsetting quite a bit of additional cost and impacts that go with that because of the nature of the transportation modes that are needed just for bikes and peds and vehicular traffic in addition to the streetcar. So one of the benefits that the current alignment has is that it capitalizes on using one of the lanes for streetcar, and when the streetcar is not there, it can either be used for vehicles or buses, to be determined in the future. So it would result in more bridge, but we have not considered that as part of the Cooch extension.
I do understand what you're saying. I was just curious if this was specifically a streetcar only bridge, because that's a separate project that will happen sometime in the future. It's an aspiration that we all have. So I was just throwing that out as an option. A vertical streetcar going through there kind of is cool. I mean, it could be a really nice thing 20 or 30 years from now.
So as part of a design criteria element to all the bridges, they're all being designed to accommodate a future streetcar. Now, when you have the
You're
tighter
designing them
curve,
to accommodate all modes. I'm sorry for talking through you, but you're designing them to accommodate all modes. And what I'm throwing out is the possibility of this being designed to only include one mode. Not all, just one. We don't have to talk about it. I just want to throw that out now. Okay, thanks.
Looks like we have two more questions, one from Art and one from Bill. So we'll pass it over to Art. Art, are we able to hear you? We can't hear you yet. Art, if we're having audio issues, maybe you can pop in your question into the chat. And in the meantime, I will go over to Bill.
Yeah, just real quick, Steve. The two short span, long span show a lift span. Could you use a bascule lift there too, or are you stuck with a lift span in those two cases?
you absolutely can use a bascule span there. So these are images to represent only. So all of the options except for the enhanced seismic retrofit would or could be a bascule or a lift.
Okay.
Hi, this is Art. I wanted to ask a question about the long span, and I'm just trying to get an idea of what that design represents, because it seems like there are a lot of interchangeable parts with these. So, for instance, you just said it could be bascule or lift, but I guess I'm just trying to understand those two kind of asymmetrical wings on each side. So I understand that feature of the bridge is what's necessary for long span. I'm just trying to understand if that's what it has to look like, or if there's a less, maybe a more subtle way to achieve the same thing.
Sure. Yeah, so there's a couple of different bridge types that certainly seem to be feasible. This tight arch is one of them. You could replace a tight arch with a truss, for example. A second style is a cable stay. And the cable stay is similar to the Telecom, right, where you have a tower and then stays that extend off of it. There's different design characteristics that come with either one. With the cable stay, it's where do you place your tower that your cables extend from, and that placement of the tower is or could be complicated and tricky in this case, especially on the east side because of where you have space to land a tower. One of the advantages of the tight arch here is that you can put a support that's further east of the railroad tracks. And still transition back to a bridge width that fits between buildings that already exist further to the east. With the with the cable stay, depending on where you place that tower, you may not be able to transition back in, or you'd have to place it so far it's not feasible. And so you're looking to pull it inside of this highly sensitive geotechnical zone, which may reduce some of the real benefits that come with this longer span concept. So should a long span be selected, multiple structure types are going to be examined, and this nature of constructability and fulfilling the seismic design criteria are going to be two very key elements in determining what that approach span should be, let alone whether it should have a lift span or a bascule span, similar to the public comment that was discussed earlier. So a lot more work to be done with the long span. Again, this represents a family of different options that tries to capture a benefit of spanning over that geotechnical zone on the east side and providing more space under the bridge for Waterfront Park on the west side.
I think that's all the questions we had. So Steve, back over to you.
Okay. So I think next slide. So embedded into the questions for the alternative selection, A, what alternative? B, what should happen to traffic during construction? And so this is a reminder of those two fundamental options of a full bridge closure and then detouring traffic to other sites, or building that temporary bridge to the south of the bridge and maintaining at least one lane of traffic in either direction, plus bikes and peds during construction. And so those are the key types of questions that are be examined, and we have lots of slides to talk about each, both the alternatives and the comparison against the criteria, and then these traffic options and its comparison against the various criteria. So with that, we've developed a bunch of slides. And we're going to focus on the bridge alternatives first, and then the key differentiators within each one of those criteria topics. Later on, when we're done with this section, we'll talk about that natural pause, and then discuss the focus on a temporary bridge or no temporary bridge, and go through a similar discussion and similar types of slides. So next slide, please. So one of the things that you all may have seen as you were looking at the materials in advance is this sort of key for how to read the various slides we made. So what we did is we created this kind of nifty set of alternatives on the left, and each of the icons represent the 4 bridge alternatives: the retrofit, short span, long span, and couch extension, with green call-out boxes both in the slides and around the graphic itself, around the icon, to indicate some form of a positive differentiator, and then a red box to indicate some form of a negative indicator. And so we tried to create some icons just to help understand, oh, is this a plus or a minus amongst all these slides for each of the different groups and topics. And what we're showing in this presentation is what we believe are the key differentiators. It doesn't mean that it's everything about each of these, but what we felt is we extracted out some of those key differences that we found as we were studying those various topics and criteria and measures relative to each other. So if there's no questions about this key, we can just sort of jump right in. So the first criteria group was about seismic resiliency. And what we found as we did our comparison is that there was a significant benefit that came with the long span compared to all other alternatives. And this is really highlighted through the color coding that you're seeing on the page. The long span, in what it naturally does in the top picture, is place the columns that are at the outer ends or outside of entirely on the west side, this sort of orangey color, which represents the liquefiable zone, compared to the alternatives shown at the bottom, where that same orange section has, for the short span, 4 sets of supports or columns shown on the east and 1 column set or support set on the west. And then the retrofit has 8, and the Cooch extension has 9. And that Cooch extension has 9 just because it splits off, and so you have more foundations literally sitting in this geotechnical hazard zone. So significant benefit that comes with avoiding that risk by spanning over it as much as you can and only having 1 support in it. If there's no questions, then we can move on to the next topic. And this is where we'll hand it over to Jeff for quite a few slides, and then I'll pick it up towards the end.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And good to have everybody here. Cameron, especially good to have you back. Welcome back. So community quality of life, one of the key differentiators on this is between the number of piers and columns that you can see within the park underneath the bridge, especially in Waterfront Park. If you go to the next slide. This highlights the number of, highlights in white, all the columns for the bents that are within the Waterfront Park area and extending back towards through the Saturday Market area towards the Max station. The retrofit keeps all the columns that are there, increases the size of them as part of the retrofit. From a community quality of life, one of the things we looked at is community events and community facilities. This area is used pretty intensively for community events, Saturday Market in particular, but also other events. If you can go to the next slide. Contrast that with, here you see the short span. It has larger columns, but fewer of them. Gets rid of the one out on the harbor wall and gets rid of some to the west as well. And so it has less total footprint underneath the bridge than the retrofit, but it has more than the final one, the long span. You can go to the next slide. Here you can see columns. There you go, eliminating a lot of the obstruction, providing more light. The deck structure itself up above is thinner as well, so that raises the vertical clearance a bit, makes it a little bit lighter and brighter in there. One of the things you don't see on the slide was the Cooch alternative also had some disadvantages or some cons to it, in that it creates this new alignment that would point headlights towards residences, slight increase in noise levels as well in some locations. And next slide. So equity in EJ. So from a long-term standpoint, there weren't a lot of impacts identified from a long-term standpoint for equity in EJ, but there is this short-term impact associated with the retrofit alternative, and that's at the west end of the bridge. A retrofit would require up to 3 months closure of the important access, primary client access into Portland Rescue Mission. With the replacement, all the replacement bridges, short span, long span, and Cooch, are able to avoid that because they're replacement bridges. The abutment can be moved out, and those access points can remain open throughout construction. But it's up to a 3-month closure, somewhere between 2 and 3 months with the retrofit. That's a pretty big disadvantage of the retrofit alternative. Next slide. So crime reduction and personal safety. This one you're going to hear about a fair amount in terms of what the actual factor here is that's affecting crime reduction and personal safety. It's similar to the community quality of life. And the idea of removing more of these columns and piers underneath the bridge. In this case, you see NATO Parkway looking towards Waterfront Park. And the columns obstruct sight lines somewhat. They create niches where it's harder to provide that SEPTED principle, crime prevention through environmental design, now that they refer to as natural surveillance, where you just have better sight lines, more people are actively there, moving through, able to keep a unofficial appearance or unofficial view of where people are, what's happening around you. So that's the primary effect there, is actually a benefit. If you go to the next slide, a benefit of, sorry, this is still a retrofit, highlighting the columns for the retrofit. There you go. So a little bit better right here with a little bit more open, fewer columns. And then the final slide, the long span. There you see it's that entire area from right about the sidewalk on the east side of NATO all the way out to the shoreline, all the way out to the harbor wall would be open with the long span alternative. So it provides the greatest benefit from a crime reduction personal safety standpoint. Next slide. Okay, so there are a number of them here for business and economics, and some of these are somewhat balance each other out, contradict each other to a certain extent in some cases. So the idea of access to businesses was one of the things we looked at, and how do the different alternatives affect business access during construction in particular. The retrofit has, without a temporary bridge, the retrofit has the shortest overall construction duration. So there's a benefit in that the total length of time at which access to businesses that where that access relies on crossing the river, there's a shorter duration in which there's limitations on that because construction is just shorter. The short span, one advantage of the short span is it has less business displacement. Actually, all the alternatives except the Cooch. The Cooch has the most business displacement. That's a later slide. The retrofit and the replacement bridges except the Cooch have the least amount of business displacement. Cooch actually only displaces one additional business, but it's a fairly good sized business. Then a long span, compared to the short span, would minimize the duration of closure for some areas that may bring people, that do bring people down to this area, that probably frequent businesses, provide more activity for businesses, Saturday market in particular. So shorter duration of the Saturday market closure. Next slide. And then here's what I was mentioning about the Cooch. Cooch extension adds one additional Pacific Fruit Company, one additional business displacement. It also has some long-term impacts where you have to lower 3rd Avenue, where the new Cooch extension would go over the top. You need to lower that down. That changes your ability to access the level of the sidewalk compared to the street. It complicates some access points there to different businesses. So that's a bit of a con for the Cooch extension. Next slide. Parks and Recreation. Okay, a number of them here. As I mentioned before, the long span, the difference between the long span and all the other alternatives in terms of fewer columns underneath shows up as a benefit in a number of areas. Parks and Recreation is another one. Already talked about the benefit to Waterfront Park. So it's a benefit to the park itself, as well as to what we mentioned earlier, crime prevention and safety. Another fairly big benefit is it would have the shortest duration of closures for 3 key park or recreation facilities. One being Waterfront Park itself, this area wouldn't be closed as long. Also for the skate park, while it's not an official park or a formal park, and certainly not a city managed park, it is nevertheless an important recreational facility. The temporary closure associated with the long span would be shorter duration than with all the other alternatives. And then, of course, the Esplanade, another important park facility, recreation facility, would have the shortest duration closure for the Esplanade as well. And for the most part, the other alternatives would be just the opposite of that. Talked about the columns a little bit. One of the things going on with the columns is that obviously the retrofit would have the highest adverse effect in terms of leaving more columns or structure underneath the bridge, blocking views, making it a little bit more difficult to have recreational activities underneath the bridge. And the other replacements, the couch and the short span, would be in that middle of that range, with the long span providing most open space, the retrofit providing the least. Next slide. So the skate park, in addition to, I mentioned earlier about the duration of closure of the skate park, there's two different impacts happening to the skate park. One is that just construction activity itself, from a safety standpoint, requires the park to be closed, skate park to be closed for a certain amount of time. And that varies between alternatives, as I mentioned before. The other impact is there's a physical impact from some alternatives. The retrofit alternative, because there is a vent, existing vent and columns right in the middle of right within the skate park itself, there would actually be demolition of the skate park to be able to retrofit that vent that's located there. And it would permanently convert a portion of that space that's currently a skate park into that vent, into the bridge substructure. None of the other permanent alternatives have that physical impact. The temporary bridge does, but we'll talk about that later. And next slide.
And actually, Jeff, if we want to pause for a quick second, I know we're going through a lot of information and there's still quite a bit to come, but I don't see any hands, but if folks do have any questions before we get too far in, just want to see if anybody, oh, looks like Fred. There, I see your hand. Go right ahead, Fred. And Cameron, looks like Cameron's visually raising his hand. So why don't we go Fred and then Cameron.
Yeah, if we can go back a little bit, I was looking at the presentation graphics on community quality of life. And one of the indicators was lease, less, more, light. But yet I look at these, there's no way I can tell by looking at the graphics whether how that was accomplished. And yet, the surfacing is just kind of paving, grass, or whatever. Can you actually highlight shadows to maybe show that differential? I look at that one, and then I look at the Parks and Recreation on West Bank, and I see nicely shown shadows of a canopy, a pavilion, of trees. Shadows show up there very nicely, and I thought, maybe they could be enhanced in these other slides to show that particular feature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point, Fred. I'm sure, yeah, that can be done.
Thanks. Cameron, over to you.
I was just looking at some of these skate park photos, and I know I've been to that skate park a few times. Some of those support columns for the bridge itself are actually part of the skate park. I was about to point, and I realized I couldn't actually do that. So as part of, if we were to go with the, short span, long span, or retrofit, would those have to be cut out? Or could they theoretically have, part of them remain so that they don't have to redo all of that area around the support structure? I'm just curious of how that affects. I mean, I know how that slide affects the skate park, but with the other alternatives, would those support structures have to be removed or adapted in some way to facilitate the skate park a little better?
Yeah, good question. I'm actually going to let Steve answer that one. He's given it a lot of.
Yeah, so for the replacement alternatives, they can be, so long as there's a gap from the replacement bridge to the top of the existing column, they can be left in as much as, frankly, the skate park might want it to be left in. So there's no requirement to take it out. It can be brought all the way down and shaved and smooth. It can be left in as a feature, so long as there's enough of a gap between the new bridge and the existing element for maintenance and to not affect sort of bridge operations, well, then it's entirely up to a future design consideration.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any other hands, so I think Jeff, we'll turn it back over to you to continue along.
Okay, good. Thanks for the suggestions and questions. So on historic, this is one that there's definitely trade-offs between the alternatives, pros and cons of each. The retrofit, of course, it's the only alternative that would preserve some portions of the existing Burnside Bridge. A fair amount that gets replaced, especially on the east side, and everything else that doesn't get replaced, the deck, some of the mechanical and electrical, possibly the vascule leaves, at least they get a major retrofit. Everything that doesn't get replaced gets a major retrofit. But it would, in spite of that being a significant retrofit, structural change, and replacement, obviously it does preserve some portion of the existing Burnside Bridge, whereas none of the other alternatives do. The other, it's not shown on this slide, but one of the other pros of the Burnside Bridge is by leaving things closer to how they are and how they've been, it has a little bit less change in terms of from a visual standpoint to the broader historical context of the bridge, like the historic districts on the west side. Even though this bridge is newer than the two historic districts that are on the east side or that are on the west side, it nevertheless it would result in less change. Now, the downside of the retrofit is retrofit bridge has higher impacts on the other resources, other historic resources that the replacement alternatives largely avoid impacts to. So I mentioned that one of those is the skate park itself. It's been determined to be eligible or proposed to be eligible for the National Register. We need the official word on that from the State Historic Preservation Office, but so far they've agreed with the Historic Preservation Specialist recommendation, consultant's recommendation that it be listed on the National Register, and it's believed to be of national significance, just the unique nature and the origins of it. So the retrofit has an adverse effect on that historic resource, whereas the other alternatives do not. It also impacts the harbor wall on the west side. It takes out about 100, 150 feet of it that would be replaced. That is not considered an adverse impact. Adverse effect, that's a particular definition within the federal regulations. But nevertheless, it is an impact on the harbor wall, not really a significant one though, because there's over a mile of that harbor wall that would still be there. And then the third one that not necessarily listed here on this slide is there are a lot of, there's the potential for buried resources, especially near the bridge ends, actually on the other end, kind of near the west abutment and up on the east end, buried resources that could be pre-contact, before Europeans, as well as post-contact, that we don't know because you can't see under there. And all of the alternatives that require extensive jet grouting in the soil have a much higher potential for impacting those buried resources. So that would be every alternative except the long span, which of course spans over the vast majority of that, as Stephen referred to, the geotechnical hazard area, the highly liquefiable soils. And so the replacement options, all the replacement options as compared to the retrofit, avoid impacting the harbor wall and avoid impacting the Burnside skate park, but completely remove the historic Burnside Bridge. So as I said, quite a bit of trade-offs on the historic resources element. No questions on that.
Question from Art.
Yeah, Jeff, this came up a couple days ago, and I just think it would really help with some of the transparency and the clarity of especially the historic resources. But I mean, the harbor wall, the skate park, and the buried stuff are sort of hypotheticals, and I think what really needs to sort of be clear is that what these 4 options, the impact that they would have on the real, current landmarks and historic districts. And I think you mentioned it, in one of the April 22nd meeting that none of these are impacting. And that's the first that I had heard of that. So if that's just a given, I think there'd be a lot of value just having that in there so that it doesn't seem like we're talking about things that are hypothetical and not paying attention to kind of established landmarks and historic districts.
Okay. I should clarify though, Art, that the impacts on the skate park aren't hypothetical. It's at this point, we are assuming it's eligible for the National Register, and the retrofit does demolish it. So that's not a hypothetical impact. And the harbor wall, not an adverse effect from a Section 106 standpoint, but it is an effect. I would say the one that's uncertain, maybe not hypothetical, but certainly uncertain, is the buried resources. That one, you're always talking about potential because you just can't see you don't know what's underground until you get there. I think that if I understand the point you're trying to make is don't underemphasize the impact on the Burnside Bridge. Is that correct?
Well, no, that's not it. I guess what I'm saying is that you're spending time talking about a harbor wall, a skate park, and buried underground stuff that is there. They might be eligible, but they're not currently landmarks. And so your implication, if I understand it right, is that these options won't have effects on current landmarks and historic districts. And I'm just saying that that's not a really transparent implication. And if it is, it's just an understanding that the team has. I would say, put that down just so it's clear, so people aren't saying, well, okay, wait a minute, you're talking about a skate park and you're talking about a harbor wall. What about the Made in Oregon sign or the other landmarks that are around this building that are around the bridge that it seems like you can't help but impact?
I see. So you're talking about the local designated landmarks, local landmark districts.
Local and national. I believe the sign's national, and there are a number of, like the Skidmore Old Town's national.
Yeah, Skidmore Old Town is a national landmark district. Yes, that's correct. I was focused mostly on the kind of the federal status of these, and I would emphasize though that I wouldn't underestimate the significance of the skate park, just because up until this project we hadn't really considered it National Register eligible. I've been impressed, and I guess my eyes have been opened from the historic preservation specialist about, even though it's not very old, the importance of it from a historical cultural perspective, from the Section 1.
No, sorry. I mean, I've written articles on that park, so I know it really well. But I'm not trying to take anything away from the skate park. I'm just saying that it's a little bit of an awkward conversation when you're talking about these features like the harbor wall and the skate park and buried stuff, and you're not talking about the historic districts and the landmarks that this bridge is going right by, and you're not mentioning that at all. And if it's just as simple as saying the proposed options won't have any impact on those, then I would just say if that's a statement, then that takes away some of that confusion. But not having that and going back to the value of the skate park, which I am in no way trying to take any of that value away. I completely am on board with that. But I just think that you don't want to talk about one thing and just completely not talk about another. That kind of leads to questions.
Gotcha. Okay. So You're right that at this point, the historic cultural resources report sees no adverse effect on on either a historic district, but I should make that clear. That should be made clear when we're talking about historic resources, so people don't misunderstand that we've just ignored it.
So Jeff, we've got a couple more questions. I also want to note for folks we're about halfway through our meeting. So we'll try and keep these questions brief, but I have Peter's been waiting patiently with a hand raised, and then Gabe has a question, and Susan also has a question. So again, folks, we'll try and keep them brief, but go ahead, Peter.
Okay, my question is fairly straightforward. I'm wondering, when you do the long span and you're only using the 2 footings on each side of the river, is the footings underneath the ground bigger and deeper? I would just kind of get a sense of how much it displaces underground.
Do you want to mention
Brought
that?
that up, and it seems like that's something to think about at least.
Steve, you want to address that one?
Yes. Yes, they are generally bigger. We've done some preliminary analysis. We found that in the river, they were roughly about the same size just because of the scale of what we already had to build in. But certainly on land, on either side, they have increased in size. And we'll be looking at that a little further for whatever alternative is selected.
And there was another hand?
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, I said there was another hand as well.
Gabe had his question answered, so we're going to move to Susan.
Oh, it's just listening, interesting about the historic bridges, but the bridge itself is already on the National Historic Register, isn't it? So
Yes.
when we're saying that the retrofit demolishes the National Historic potential candidate, the skate park, any of the other models demolishes the already National Historic Burnside Bridge, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. From a federal regulatory standpoint, being on the register or being determined eligible are equal, just for background, in terms of regulatory protection.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean the 2 resources are equal. We aren't making a judgment about that.
All right, looks like we don't have any other hands. So Jeff, back over to you.
Okay. So the visual and aesthetics, if you recall, we had 3 criteria there, and the first one addresses all about existing views and how will the different bridge alternatives affect existing views and existing view corridors. And obviously, the more that the bridge looks like the same profile, especially the vertical profile is one of the things we looked at as the existing bridge, the less effect it's going to have on view. So retrofit would have the least. Short span and Cooch extension, because they are considered kind of in-kind alternatives and have a similar vertical sort of physical presence to the retrofit. They would also have the least impact on existing views. Whereas the long span, next slide, long span, by having above deck structure, is going to have the largest potential impact on existing views, because all that structure is above the deck. You can do the next slide. The next part, actually, I'm sorry, the next one after this. The other aspect, we recall the criteria visual aesthetics was, oh, sorry, go back again. It's not there. I'll just talk about it. The other thing that we looked at, the other visual criteria that you all adopted, had to do with potential for creating new visual experiences. And in that regard, the long span was considered to have the greatest advantage in terms of more opportunities for iconic structures that could be seen from farther away, for opening the area underneath for additional visual and light underneath, visual experiences underneath, probably greater potential for gateway experiences, things like that. So there's the trade-off. Longspan has the con in terms of the largest impact to existing views, which could be adverse, but also has the pro in terms of it creates the most opportunity because it would be the most different from the existing bridge for new visual experiences. The next slide. Yeah. And natural resources, there were a number of things associated with that.
Actually, I had a question. Sorry.
Yeah.
I just to back up to the visual and aesthetics, if you could, in the future, maybe just pan back on that, like slide 18. And I'm just channeling Hillary's comment just from the other day, just about the Made in Portland sign, the Made in Oregon sign. That doesn't. I think a lot of people don't realize the impact that this long span has on that, and I think at least airing that out and kind of having the slide be transparent would be helpful.
Could you go to the next slide? Because I think, is that the one that talks about it? Yeah, we couldn't show every possible perspective. We didn't show every possible perspective, but in the criteria where we're doing the ratings, I added that in particular about the sign, some views of the sign from the bridge and from other locations could be blocked. The criteria obviously goes into a lot more depth. The rating goes into a lot more depth about the different urban design features and some of the views and view corridors that would be obstructed or affected by different alternatives. And as Art mentioned, the Made in Oregon sign is one that the above deck structure would obstruct your views of that Made in Oregon sign from different viewpoints. Okay, next one. So one of the things we looked at from a natural resource perspective was what's happening in the river. It's important. Salmon habitat, there's water quality issues, there's flooding issues, things like that when you put more fill in the river. The short span and the Cooch extensions, Cooch extension have a more fill in the river than the long span. The long span just has the two main piers on either side of the movable span. Both the short span and Cooch extension have additional piers, and some of those piers are in shallow water near the eastern shoreline. That's considered a little bit higher value from a fish habitat standpoint. Long span has impacts clearly in the river too, but a little bit less. The retrofit also adds more fill within the floodplain of the river, which is a pretty important issue here, especially when we're trying to get a handle on how might the bridge be affected by climate change or how might it affect flooding during future more frequent and maybe more severe flooding events. Go to the next slide. Okay, so this just shows shows where the additional fill is coming or fill is coming in the river. The other thing that was a differentiator to a certain extent was greenhouse gas emissions during construction. They were all essentially equal from a long-term standpoint for greenhouse gas emissions because they all have essentially the same capacity for motor vehicles in transit, including transit. But in construction, there's a difference in that the retrofit just has less overall construction activity, fewer new materials, so there is less greenhouse gas emissions embedded in those materials, and a shorter construction duration, 3.5 years, a little bit less construction activity. So the total estimated greenhouse gas emissions during construction is lower with the retrofit alternative.
Jeff, looks like we have a question from Cameron.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, could you go back one slide? I guess it's not. There you go. I was just curious as to whether or not it was possible to do, for example, the long span on the eastern side and a short span on the west side. Is that possible to do or not? I was just curious.
Definitely possible. I'll let Steve talk about it though.
Yes, it is possible. It eliminates some of the benefit that you're getting on the west side by staying away from the geotechnical hazard zone. It also introduces some column placements in and around a whole bunch of utilities that you're otherwise avoiding with a longer span. But the answer is yes, it comes with probably more impacts, but yes, it's possible.
Great. Back to you, Jeff.
Okay, I think that was the last slide on natural resources. If there aren't any questions, then it's on to Steve. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So this grouping was pedestrians, bicycles, and people with disabilities. And what it effectively shows is compared to the retrofit, all of the replacement options get a boost in width, going from this 5.5 and 7.3 to about 20.5, which effectively means there's about 8 more feet for bikes and peds and people with disabilities that happen with all of the replacements relative to the retrofit. Next slide. And so in addition to that is this hard barrier that is placed the full extent of the bridge that separates vehicles from the bikes and peds. And so that increases safety. And because of the offset that's also enabled through that additional 8 feet, you're further away from the exhaust and the emission of vehicles compared to the retrofit itself, where you're tucked up and running against the inside lane of traffic. The one downside for the Cooch extension is just the whole nature of the Cooch extension and the way that you have the Ankeny Bikeway and some sidewalks frame in underneath. You're no longer able to utilize a pedestrian bikeway plaza that runs up from 3rd into the Cooch area. So you have to extend and sort of wrap around onto Davis to get onto the westbound direction. And so there is some disincentive because of the connectivity to East Bank Esplanade and that change to your access onto the Cooch extension. Next slide. From motor vehicles, freight, and emergency vehicles, this is really a comparison of the options. And frankly, there wasn't a lot of long-term difference between the two, but the most notable is by having a more gradual, smoother curvature or alignment rather than a tighter S-curve, it's slightly easier for trucks and freight vehicles.
And Steve, we have a question from Susan, who I think was regarding some of the last slides. So I'm going to pause for a second. She wanted to make a comment. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, unfortunately, I just unmuted right when the dog is starting to bark, but these things happen. I have some concerns about the aesthetics of the new option, because I know that we rated the aesthetics and views not very high in comparison to other things. So I was trying to find out from whoever designed the one with those tall risers there, if you had done any kind of field work around the set, because we didn't know about this option before until I guess now. If you'd done any kind of focus group, or what had you done around that design? Because it's pretty visually, many people might see it as kind of visually impairing, or especially with a north-south view. So.
Sure. So if we can go back to a couple of slides that highlight the
I did raise my hand during all this, but I just didn't get called on. That was the problem. So.
There we go. There, perfect. So admittedly, we have not done very much whatsoever with refining a design for this lift option. So what you're seeing is pretty crude and blocky. And in part, it's because there just hasn't been a lot of effort that's gone into a
No,
conversation.
Is that Steve? No, sorry, I don't. I'm sorry. I don't mean the block, the lift. I'm talking about the long span, um, the supports, the suspension supports, or whatever they are. Those. That's what I'm talking about. Not so much the lift.
Got it. The good news is everything I just said is still true even for this. So the way we approached this was a pretty high level general sizing parameters of a certain span length. You go up a certain height. With that certain height, you may have to have some cross bracing. So we haven't done a whole lot in terms of refinement to get to something that would possibly be more elegant. We wanted to have something that was representative and sort of a close approximation. Should this be selected? Certainly that's where the conversation goes. And it's not just a how do you make the sizing something that feels possibly lighter, subject to what the urban design conversation goes, but also just a different way to frame it in and make the piers look and everything else. So a lot more work would go into a type selection study should this alternative be selected. And we didn't do a whole lot, nor did we have much of a conversation with anyone from a sort of an aesthetics urban design standpoint. We're trying to minimize an aesthetic feel for it and try to get into what the qualities and attributes are of a longer span. So more to come there if it's selected.
All right, thank you.
Okay. And so if there are no other questions on this one, we can go to the next slide, which looks virtually the same. I don't know if you could tell the slide even changed, but this is for transit. And it really has the same type of benefits for transit. By having a more gradual curve, it can improve operations, which really means speed through this area. Granted, it's only a small segment of your entire corridor, but you can improve at least speed through the S-curve. And it does because you're avoiding putting the future streetcar through the S-curve. You can avoid some potential collisions of it or buses relative to other vehicles. Granted, there have not been crashes to date with vehicles going through the S-curve in the last, well, to date, meaning the last 7 years or so. But we understand that that's a byproduct of an S-curve and a short period of time. But so having a more gradual curvature and alignment would improve and eliminate this potential sort of side swipe possibility if you keep the S-curve.
Looks like we have another question from Art. Art, you can go ahead.
Well, Steve, I sort of had a question on that. I thought it was interesting that the text on 25 says improves visibility and eliminates potential vulnerability for transit collisions. And I was just going to say, like, I thought that was one of the safest areas. So how do you improve? Like you're saying, if we make it faster with better visibility, that'll make it safer. But I thought what you found was that it was actually really safe the way it is because there's not good visibility and it forces people to slow down.
Yeah, so it's great point. So the key principle here is number one, with the more gradual alignment, you're protected by vehicular barriers. And so all bikes and peds are behind a barrier, a hard physical safety barrier, whereas today that doesn't exist through the S-curve. It's so there's one element to a functional protective barrier that helps in that. The other part, and we're sort of forecasting, is that the uses in and around the S-curve are changing, right? Throughout the last number of years, there haven't been the buildings built out that are attracting as many people, and even today, there's still a development there that would attract more bicycles and pedestrians in that space around the S-curve. So while you're exactly right, we were surprised by it. There is no crash data through the S-curve. We know that unfortunately, at some point that might change, especially with an attraction and gathering more bicycles and pedestrians in the same zone. So you're right. The numbers suggest that it may not be that safe of an area, in part because it's so tight, you slow people down. It's a natural traffic calming area, but it does not have the same land uses in the past 7 years as it will going forward. So that helped us to make that judgment call.
All right, Steve, I think you can keep on going. We're nearly there.
Okay. All right, so the next slides are about fiscal responsibility, which really gets into cost. And the way these slides are set up is we're going to work from left to right, or from the retrofit option to the Cooch connection. So the first one, the retrofit option, we thought when we first started all of this that this was going to be the low cost option. In fact, it's not. And there's the two types of replacement are generally cheaper than what the enhanced seismic retrofit is. So the numbers that are shown here are the overall construction cost, and then the shading represents the additional cost should there be some form of temporary bridge, in this case the full temporary bridge, which is about $90 million. So the bottom number, 895, is the cost if you're detouring all traffic, and the upper cost, in this case, 985, is the cost if you're maintaining traffic on site, one lane each direction with a temporary bridge. So this one came out to be, frankly, the third highest cost, and has the largest maintenance cost over time. And that makes sense because you're trying to preserve a 95-year-old bridge for another 100 years. And so embedded into it is a lot of cost to maintain the enhanced seismic retrofit. The next alternative is the replacement short span, which is a little cheaper than the retrofit. And it has the least long-term maintenance costs. And in part, it's just because the amount of materials to maintain are slightly smaller and slightly less technologically advanced is what we'd be talking about in terms of the replacement long span. So it's the second cheapest alternative. Only the long span replacement, next slide, is cheaper. And this long span is cheaper in large part because you've eliminated the need to do so much in the ground geotechnical mitigation work. You avoided some utility relocation work. You've avoided some other risks that come with it. Now, you're trading a lot of the below ground cost for building more superstructure above, and usually there's a question of, does it end up costing more overall? And the answer in this case was no, because that geotechnical hazard mitigation and the risks that come with it are so great that it became the least expensive alternative of the four. And the Cooch extension itself is the most expensive, and it shouldn't be that much of a surprise. You have more bridge than any of the others. You have more foundations in the geotechnical hazard zones than anything else, and therefore you have to pay for all of the mitigation that goes with it. You also have so many members that the long-term maintenance cost is pretty high. It's the highest of all the replacement options, still less in general than the retrofit, but the highest of all the replacement options. So with that, I'll pause because I think I see some questions that might be coming up.
Yeah, we've got some questions. I see Paul and Sharon and Ed, Howie have questions. So Paul, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
So is the cost here the construction cost? Because you also have in the notes mentioning maintenance cost, and I'm wondering, is what we're seeing the construction cost plus an annualized maintenance cost, or is it just construction?
Excellent question. So the costs you're seeing on this graphic are only the project total cost, which includes construction, design, engineering to support, utility relocations, right-of-way acquisition. Those are the cost numbers you see here. There are actually two criteria in fiscal responsibility. One is the overall project cost, which is what this graphic shows. The second is long-term maintenance cost. So those are not included in this, but we assess those as a second criteria as part of fiscal responsibility. And so because of that, we've built these two boxes that address both direct cost, project cost, and the cost for long-term maintenance onto each of these slides.
Great. It's either Sharon or Ed. I don't know which one, but you have the floor. Go right ahead.
I was curious why the cost of the temporary bridge is lower for the short span option. Is there any particular reason why that's shown as like 70 million versus 90 million?
It should, I would have to review that. I believe it should be about 90 million. And so it could be that I made a math error on the sheet.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Howie, I think you also have a question. Oh, you're muted. I'm going to unmute you.
My question was answered, so I'm good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bill, I think you also had a question. Go right ahead.
Yeah, Steve, wouldn't your delta, your plus or minus be a lot greater for 1, 2, and 4 because of the unknowns due to the geotech hazard zone? Your certainty is those might be low estimates that you're showing there.
Yeah, good question. So how we developed these is we went in and developed a engineering-based estimate to come up with a base cost. And so how much materials for bridge columns and how many steel girders and how much removal and all that. So we did this build of quantities to come up with a price. We then had a cost risk session, and in that cost risk session, we established a whole number of risks that could drive pricing. And in some cases, some alternatives were very good in terms of eliminating risk. The long span replacement, for example, was very good at eliminating the geotechnical mitigation risk that is out there. It could be a lot more expensive. And so we went through an exercise of analyzing each of these 4 alternatives through a risk lens and came up with the numbers that we did that are shown in the bottom, the 895, 870, 825, and 950. And so those are all risk-adjusted prices based on experts asking the exact kind of questions that you just brought up. And then we built on top of it what the cost of a temporary bridge would be.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
And Peter, I'm not sure if you have a question or if your hand is just up from the last round. But Peter, do you have a question?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I guess I'd have to put my hand down then. Is that what happens?
Yeah, that's all right. You could just click it again. And also Sharon and Ed, if you want to click it again, the hand should be blue when it's raised and black when it's not raised.
Sorry about that.
Thanks. I don't see any other questions at the moment. So I think we've come to the end of these slides, and we're going to, oh, does Art have a question? Art, I think that was, we got your question earlier, but just want to make sure. Art, did you have a question?
So, no, you got my question earlier.
We got it earlier. Great, thank you. So we're going to go into the traffic options. I think most folks are still here. We've heard a lot of questions and thoughts from people, but as maybe the team gets the slides going, if you do want to get up and stretch, it's been a long go, and some of you, I know, we can see you on the videos, have been sitting and paying attention intently, so feel free to go ahead and stretch. But in the interest of time, I say we go ahead and keep moving. So on to traffic options during construction.
Okay, so this is a very similar slide to the one that explained providing the icons. This section 2 is all about the differentiation and benefits according to each of the criteria of a temporary bridge versus a full closure or detouring to another site. So those icons on the left, similar to before, red is a negative differentiator, green is a positive differentiator, and it really is comparing not the alternatives, but as each relates to a full closure versus a temporary bridge. And sometimes you'll see in these presentations, we have these additional icons for the type of temporary bridge reviewed. is that all modes, meaning one lane of general purpose traffic, could be any kind of traffic, plus bikes and peds. A bus bike ped only temporary bridge, which we analyzed, and a bike ped only temporary bridge. So the bike ped only is narrower compared to the other two. And frankly, from a cost standpoint, it's about 60 million rather than the 90 million for either one of the other two. So that's the key. And we'll move on to the next slide. And so from a seismic resiliency standpoint, this is where we're talking about short-term criteria. So again, if you guys remember, you developed a whole suite of long-term criteria and then some short-term. And so these are only addressing those short-term criteria. So in the case for seismic resiliency, the question was, how soon can whatever the solution is be implemented? Because seismic resiliency is a priority, it has to happen as fast as humanly possible. And so in this case, the full closure is better because it generally reduces the overall project timeline from start to finish by either 1.5 or 2 years. And so that makes adding a temporary bridge versus this goal, this criteria, worse. And you'll see a lot of this kind of a flavor of a dependency on time that comes with a temporary bridge built into many of these. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff, and he'll keep rolling from for a number of slides.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And Allison, when you see a hand up, just feel free to pause me whenever you see a question.
I will, thank you.
So the community quality of life, there's a couple aspects that we're looking at here. One is that the full closure, it has the advantage, and this will come up, you'll see this come up on a number of the criteria. It's just the shorter duration of construction, getting through construction faster, 1.5 years faster. It comes up as an advantage for the full closure on a number of criteria. Temporary bridge, of course, has a longer duration closure, which means community facilities are closed longer, the Esplanade is closed longer, a Saturday market is relocated to another location for a longer period of time. Skate park, considered a community facility as well, is closed for longer duration. There is some advantage though with a temporary bridge in that you maintain at least, you maintain cross river access, of course, during the construction phase, even though that construction phase lasts 1.5 years longer. Next slide. The equity in EJ, again, this has some trade-offs that, as I said, they're going to be fairly common. The shorter duration closure, from an equity in EJ standpoint, was considered to be an advantage. In particular, the Skidmore Max station would be closed less, not as often, or not as long a period of time. It also means shorter total closure of that crossing for clientele of the social service agencies. But on the flip side of that, the downside, of course, of the full closure is that you don't have direct access for social service clientele. We've talked, it came up in a number of conversations we had with social service providers that a very, desirable mitigation would be TriMet passes under the conditions of a full closure. The other thing to keep in mind here too is the temporary bridge. It does have this advantage of obviously providing access for, depending on which temporary bridge you went with, for one or all modes would be continually available across the river. Reduced capacity, of course, but nevertheless, some access would be maintained. That was the key temporary issue for equity environmental justice. The other thing we looked at too was that the facilities that might be used by people who don't own automobiles, maybe tend to use the Esplanade more, or are using the area under the bridge for shelter during the day. That full closure means that area isn't closed off for as long a period of time. Next slide. Business and economics, again, this is a very similar story to the others. Access was the primary thing that was different. And just like very similar to community quality, although here we were looking for the most part at the crossing. On the positive side, with a full closure, it means that it's a year and a half less of there being restrained or constrained access across the river. But the temp bridge at least provides up to 2 lanes of traffic and pedestrian bike. So that's the advantage of that. And it's fairly straightforward from a business and economic standpoint. Next slide. So Parks and Recreation, there are a couple things happening here with, again, this is about duration of closure again. Because with the tent bridge versus no tent bridge, the area of the park that's closed, temporarily closed to the public, pretty much the same. The area doesn't vary much between tent bridge and no tent bridge. You put a tent bridge in, then you are removing 6 large trees that aren't removed without a tent bridge. That's considered, that's not a permanent impact, but it's going to last longer than construction, obviously. These are 40, maybe year-old trees, so it takes a while to bring those back. But the duration of closure, again, is the biggest issue here. The Esplanade, with the temporary bridge, the Esplanade is closed longer. The waterfront park area, Saturday market area is closed longer. The skate park is closed longer. Greater duration of impacts on physical activity.
Jeff, we've got a question from Cameron. I'm wondering if we can pause for a second.
Yeah, could we actually just go back to the business? When you guys were checking this sort of stuff, was there any indication in terms of river traffic being disrupted during this time period? Was there a differentiator between these 2 alternatives?
Yes, good question. That one didn't make the slide. These are based on just internally kind of figuring out judging what seemed to be the primary differences, but there is a difference between the duration or number of closures associated with temporary bridge or no temporary bridge. There would be more closures associated with building the temporary bridge for navigation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
All right, back over to you, Jeff.
Next slide. So historic resources, the main difference between with temp bridge versus no temp bridges, I think I mentioned this before, is that the temporary bridge requires some structure to be built, support underneath the temporary bridge within the area that's currently occupied by the skate park. It is only for the duration that the temporary bridge is there, so anywhere from 4.5 to 6.5 years, that area would need to be completely closed off. Whereas without a temporary bridge, then the closure would be completely dependent upon the main alternative that you're constructing. And that closure would be substantially less than the full duration of construction, especially with some alternatives versus others. So the temporary bridge of the no temporary bridge avoids any physical impacts to the skate park itself and would have a shorter duration closure of the skate park versus with a temp bridge. Next slide. Just one other factor is that this didn't rise to the level of being an adverse effect in terms of the federal regulatory process for reviewing impacts to historic resources, but it was pointed out that the temporary bridge does add additional clutter during construction, and increases the duration of construction by 1.5 years. But I want to point out that construction itself, construction as a whole, is not considered a significant significant impact on the historic context of the area. So the temporary bridge does add some, but again, it's not considered a significant impact from a temporary standpoint. Next. Natural resources, there's a pretty stark difference. We heard this from a number of natural resource agency people as well as others. There's more fill in the river. during the time that the bridge is there. That's a displacement of habitat. It increases the risk of greater flood rise if floods were to happen during construction. And there's a lot more in-water piles that need to be either driven, possibly vibrated in. But the risk for impacts to fish, the water quality and flooding are notably greater with the temporary bridge than without it, just because of the volume of structure and the amount of activity that has to occur in water to build and then ultimately deconstruct and remove the temporary bridge. From the other thing we looked at too, it doesn't show on the slide, is greenhouse gas emissions. We had a lot of concern that a full closure of the bridge during construction, in other words, no temporary bridge, that the amount of traffic detouring and delay and congestion that could result from that, we were worried that it could put greenhouse gas emissions, kind of through the roof. So the analysis looked at greenhouse gas emissions that resulted from diversion of traffic associated with the full closure, as well as from diversion of traffic associated with the temporary bridge. And remember, there is a lane in each direction so that motor vehicles, trucks, freight, et cetera, can still cross, but substantially reduced capacity. So there's a fair amount of delay associated with that, and not the same level of greenhouse gas emissions as with no temporary bridge. But when you add on top of that the embedded greenhouse gas emissions associated with the steel and the concrete that goes into building the temporary bridge, and then the construction equipment emissions themselves to build that, it's a big effort. It's a fairly large bridge to be building. So that the total greenhouse gas emissions during construction come out a little bit higher with the temporary bridge than without it, when you add both traffic detour greenhouse gas emissions and the embedded emissions associated with constructing the temporary bridge.
Jeff, we've got a question from
Yeah.
Art.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff, I have a couple questions, so maybe I'll just kind of shoot them to you and then you can answer them. This one question is just, for instance, on this, well, I'm looking at slide 37, just the hard copy. And for instance, there, it shows the temporary bridge, and that's, the new bridge is kind of faded back. And so, like, maybe more on the west side, like, does the temporary bridge create a new footprint different than the footprint of the new bridge, or is it basically on top of that, like on the west side, where essentially it's like, what is the footprint impact of the temporary bridge?
Could you go back to slide 37, Allison? Right there. You're talking about on the west side. Yeah, there are clearly new supports there, new columns that would not be there with the permanent bridge. That's what you're asking.
Does that go all the way back? Like, the new bridge would create new columns that would cross like NATO. Is that right? The temporary bridge would create new columns that cross NATO. Is that right?
Like on the west side of NATO?
Right.
Steve, you want to answer
Right,
that?
I'm ready for it. So I'll say this: framing in the temporary bridge onto the approach spans is very complicated, and it's as we've developed our sequencing, it's 4 or 5 different construction stages where you're building part of a temporary bridge, part of a new bridge, and then your temporary bridge has to frame into a new element you just built, and your traffic reverses on itself. So its footprint in some places, like you can see in the foreground of a waterfront park, it's over space, over the park itself. But in other areas, it frames over what the new bridge will be. And eventually the new bridge will be part of and sort of incorporated into the roadway service of your temporary roadway area. So long story short, lots of construction staging, flipping back and forth. This happens on both the west side and the east side. And it's really difficult when you're talking about maintaining this temporary bridge and the skate park at the same time. So it's just like it's shown, the overlap is not necessarily creating new space in the very bottom of the picture, but it is using the existing bridge space, depending on where you are in the construction sequence.
And my other two questions, I think I think they're to you, Steve, but one question I've asked before about the temporary bridge is just, is it, like, how much or what percent of existing vehicle travel, or maybe it doesn't need to be vehicle, maybe it can just be people using the bridge, bike and pedestrian, I think primarily vehicle. Like, is there a projection that the temporary bridge can accommodate 80% of that, 50% of that? And then the last question I had was just, is it understood that this temporary bridge has to come down, that there's not a possibility that it could just not come down magically? And I'm not a fan of it staying up, but I'm just saying, like federally, does this thing like have a permit for 8 years and then it has to be gone?
So in terms of the temporary bridge, it's not designed to last anything beyond the design life of the construction phase. So it's like a 10 to 15 year design life. So your columns are typically steel posts or tubes. They're set on either crane pads, or they're drilled into the ground, depending on where you are, if you're the river or not. Everything is meant to be removed when the construction phase is over. So all of it is temporary. In fact, you don't even design for seismic in a temporary condition like this. So these are, in a lot of ways, the bridge beams feel like they're permanent, but the entire assembly of them is built in a temporary condition and for a very, very short lifespan rather than 100 years of the permanent structure. So I think that was the second question. And
So I think there was a first part of that question about the capacity that temporary bridge could take, but I also want to recognize that Howie's been waiting with a question as well, and we're closing in on the end of our meeting. Jeff or Steve, can you give any illumination to the other part of Art's question?
See, the question was, what capacity of the existing traffic on Burnside, vehicle traffic in particular, could be accommodated on the temporary bridge with one lane in each direction? I don't remember the traffic numbers. Do you remember what kind of percentage-wise what they are?
Percentage-wise, no. Well, it's 3 lanes in one direction and 2 lanes in the other. The temporary bridge has 1 lane in either direction. So from just a pure scale, it's either 1/2 or 1/3 of the existing capacity is what the temporary bridge could handle. Then you start getting into congestion effects and what is your true capacity versus what your built capacity is. But the next few slides would show what the travel time difference is between having a temporary bridge and not having a temporary bridge. So I think the travel time is a better indicator than maybe what sheer volume might suggest.
So with that, Howie, you've been waiting patiently. Over to you.
Okay, I'm noticing the temporary bridge goes through the Saturday Market site where the plinth is, which is the glass roof construct on Waterfront Park. Would the 1.5 to 2 years added onto the project include the restoration of Waterfront Park and the plinth and other areas? And is it included in the budget?
Yeah, that does have to get removed. The plan is it would be deconstructed, so not demolished. That gets removed, stored, and then installed back in place. And I'm going to let Steve answer, but I believe that is included in the total construction duration.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, great. Well, with that, I think we'll keep moving.
Okay, I think I have the last of my slides, I believe. Yeah, on to Steve.
Yep. So the next few slides are different ways to compare how pedestrians, bicycles, I guess the travel time delays between the different alternatives with or without a temporary bridge. So the takeaway is with the full closure, there's an additional 5 to 12 minutes for bikes and additional 10 to 18-minute delay for pedestrians to cross. And I might, because of time, sort of just walk through each of these slides and we can ask the questions about each one. So So that's for bicycles and peds. Next slide is for motor vehicles. And going back to the question, having a temporary bridge still has congestion. And so that's one of the takeaways. Having a single lane of traffic does not give you the same capacity that exists out there today. And so the way we capture this is, what is the difference in travel time depending on all these different routes you might take up or down river of the bridge itself? And what we found through our analysis, that a full closure only adds an additional 2 to 4 minutes of travel time delay for vehicles compared to having the temporary bridge. And in some cases, that's on the lower end because you're not in and around other maybe congested areas. And then further to the north is where you get to that about 4 minute of additional travel time without having a temporary bridge. So that was a significant finding through our traffic analysis. And it's a byproduct of the temporary bridge only has one lane each direction, and therefore there's congestion, and therefore it's only a 2 to 4 minute additional delay if you don't have a temporary bridge at all. Next slide. For transit, this is one where it does depend on what your temporary bridge is. And so for a temporary bridge that's multimodal, you still have that congestion, and then buses have to go up to the next bridge to the north. And so it adds about a 5 minute delay for buses without a temporary bridge. If you had a temporary bridge that was bus only, you actually gain a little bit of time. You actually have about a better service time than even the existing bridge, just because it's a bus only structure. So that's how the results came out for transit. And obviously with the bike ped, it's the same for buses as not having a temporary bridge at all. So you'd have to go with that additional 5 minute detour. And so those 3 slides are the basic takeaway on travel time delay comparisons. And if there's no questions on that, I can move to cost.
I don't see any hands at the moment, so we'll keep it moving.
And so basically, this is the same information I presented before. The temporary bridge adds about $90 million for the full width option. So that's whether it's the general purpose lanes or the bus only lanes. That full width is about a $90 million add. And the bike ped only option is a $60 million add. And so those are the costs that come with each of those types. And with that, I think we are at the end of all of the differentiating slides.
So folks, I'm not seeing any hands raised, but this is kind of our opportunity. We are closing in at the end of our meeting. We have 7 minutes left, but if you do have questions, oh, Cameron, there's a hand. I knew that there would be one. Over to you.
Yeah, I'm sorry to ask a long time ago. On the business aspect of the different options, was there any sort of difference in terms of river traffic navigation, in terms of how long or how often the navigable path would be closed for river traffic with the different options?
The 2 places, the 2 areas where we saw differences were with, like I mentioned, temporary versus no temporary bridge. Temporary having more duration of temporary closures, and then bascule lift versus lift span. Longer temporary closures with the bascule lift than with the lift span. The alternatives themselves, long span, short span, retrofit, I think they were all equal. Do you recall offhand, Steve?
Yeah. So what we did is we created the criteria of a certain width and built into the cost estimate some amount of tug assist. So because of that, and that was, you know, formulated, and we got the feedback as we did our navigation study. We didn't preclude any vessels just because we would have just more tug assist. We built it in as a cost. So that was how we handled that question.
Okay, thank you.
And looks like we have another question from Art. Art, go right ahead.
I just had a kind of a final comment, just because this, like, slide 42 is really interesting, and if you could lay over that, or maybe add a follow-up slide that shows the duration of construction for each of those, just so you can kind of compare the cost and the length of construction would be helpful.
Good comment. We can do that. And to help answer that question, the first box for the retrofit is an additional 1.5 years, and the last 3 boxes are additional 2 years. In terms of the trade-off between paying for it versus the construction time.
All right, I am not seeing any other hands raised. Was that somebody trying to chime in? Okay, so I think this is back over to Heather to talk a little bit about our upcoming next steps. Heather, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so again, we kind of talked about this at the beginning of the meeting, but at our next meeting, we'll be discussing the results of the alternative evaluation and getting to a recommended TA. If we need to, we'll continue into June with that conversation, and then again, taking that back to our agencies, the public. We do come back to you in September, even though it's not shown on here, with the results from our outreach, and then our policy group, where you will be making the final recommendation around APA to take out into our draft EIS. So I think that's what we had for next steps, Allison.
Great. Any final questions from folks? This is our first meeting. Oh, we do have a question from Bill. Go right ahead. Bill, are you there? We can't see you. Oh, there we go. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, sorry. Art mentioned that, you know, that long span bridge, the arch on the east side is very large in proportion to the rest of the bridge. Steve, would it be possible to, maybe to offset the height of that arch, make, you'd be putting a pier right in the middle of that geohazard zone, but I mean, two arches instead of one would minimize the height of that. Is that a possibility, or?
It is. It is. There are, I mean, well, just like anything, there's trade-offs to adding more substructure elements. And yes, the east length is much longer than the west length. There is some flexibility to some degree in where do you place the river piers, and that's a way to help maybe reduce the span length on the east side. And that's something that would be looked into in a type selection phase, if that's the preferred alternative. But yeah, you could add an additional support in the liquefiable zone. It just comes with all the negatives that it has another support in the liquefiable zone. And then the question is, where do you place it? There are some very tight physical limitations to where you can put a column between the existing freeway lanes, or between the freeway and the railroad, or on just the other side of the railroad. And so there just aren't that many options to place another column in there, but that's something that we would be exploring if that's the way that it went.
Yeah, okay. I was just looking for perhaps a little more balanced, you know, the overall bridge.
Sure.
All right, and I also see a hand up from Marie. Go right ahead, Marie.
You know, the elephant in the room here, how is this project going to be impacted by the pandemic and our current situation?
Alice, do you want me to take that? This is Mike.
Mike, I think go right ahead. You might be the right person for this.
Well, it's interesting. Sometimes recessions create infrastructure funds. You know, we've seen that with past recessions. The Great Recession led to federal stimulus funding. I should note that the way the project is funded all the way through this phase and design is through a vehicle fee, not a gas tax. So people don't tend to sell their vehicle as much as I know if it was gas tax, we'd be seeing a bigger decline in our funding base, but we're all based on the vehicle fee for this project from planning and design. Now, there's also talk of us being in the Metro funding measure that's going to be on the November ballot. You know, that can be affected by the pandemic. That's just, you know, it's hard to know which way that will go. But sometimes recessions come with infrastructure spending because it's a good way to put people back to work. Maybe that's a happy look at it, but that's what I got.
Thanks, Mike. So folks, with that, we'll go ahead and close up our meeting. If you do have any thoughts or ideas on ways that this can go more smoothly in the future, or that it can feel more productive, as we most likely will be continuing to have meetings remotely, at least until public health directives change, please do get in touch with the project team and send through any thoughts, ideas, tips, and tricks to make this comfortable and efficient and meaningful for you. So if you would like to turn on your camera, oh, because Sharon and Ed have something to say, go right ahead.
Well, sorry to be coming in late here, but maybe another quick question. That's another concern in addition to pandemic is how this project's going to interface and coordinate with the I-5 project that seems to be probably going on about the same time.
Which part of I-5?
I assume the widening of I-5 through there, and I assume that there's going to be coordination between it, but the public may have a lot of questions about how this is going to be coordinated. It may not affect the choice of the preferred alternative, although if we can stay out of the right of way of the highway, it's certainly going to minimize the chances of competition for who's going to work in that space at the given time during construction.
Megan, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, thankfully, we have relationships with the consultants on the I-5 Rose Quarter project, and we've already started our regular coordination meetings. And the plan is to definitely coordinate on traffic impacts, as well as seeking out opportunities to leverage the proximity and similar type of work of the projects. There could be benefits in doing so. So we've already begun coordinating, and we have heard for several years now, how can all the agencies work together to mitigate the overall traffic impact that all these mega projects will have on the region, because they are all being constructed at one time.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Well, I think with that, I've seen some videos come on. It's nice to see your faces. Thank you for joining us and taking time from your families and whatever else you're doing these days. So it's much appreciated. Get in touch with the team if you have any ideas on ways to make this better and more productive for you. Thank you so much. Please stay safe, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care, folks.
Thanks, Allison.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Cassie.
Everyone, thanks.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.